Welcome, wanderer of the waking world. Lay down your thoughts and step softly into the realm between dreaming and remembering. Tonight's story weaves together two seekers of the soul, Carl Gustav Jung, the cartographer of the collective unconscious, and John Beebe, the architect of the living typology. Together and apart, they illuminated the hidden structure of personality, one building the foundation, the other raising the dwelling where consciousness moves through rooms we recognize as ourselves. As you settle into bed, let the rhythm of my voice carry you closer to sleep, one idea at a time. Relax as we explore how these two minds approach the architecture of personality, one seeing types as fixed orientations toward the world, the other discovering a dynamic dance of archetypal figures moving through 8 functions. Their dialogue, whether spoken or across time, illuminates the vast territories of human consciousness. If you enjoy these quiet tales of psychological dialogue and wonder, press the like button and subscribe to join me on future journeys through the conversations between great minds. Tell me in the comments which psychological relationship intrigues you most, the mentor and student, the collaborators, the friendly rivals, and together we'll explore them in nights to come. Now, let the world fade. Drift with me through the intertwining paths of Jung and John Beebe as we wander between their visions and listen to the echoes where their insights meet and part. In the early years of the 20th century, when psychology was still young and uncertain of its territory, Carl Gustav Jung began noticing patterns in how people engaged with the world. Some turned outward, drawing energy from external objects and relationships. Others turned inward, finding sustenance in the interior landscape of thought and feeling. This observation, simple on its surface, would grow into one of his most enduring contributions to psychology, the theory of psychological types. But Jung, ever the explorer of depths, did not stop at the surface distinction between extroversion and introversion. He observed 4 functions, thinking, feeling, sensation, and intuition that people use to navigate reality. Some led with logic, dissecting the world into categories. Others led with values, seeking harmony and meaning. Some trusted their senses, grounding themselves in concrete facts. Others followed hunches, perceiving possibilities invisible to the physical eye. Jung published his major work on this subject, Psychological Types, in 1921. It was a dense, philosophical tome, drawing on literature, history, and his own clinical observations. He proposed that each person had a dominant function and an inferior function, with the inferior dwelling in shadow, undeveloped and primitive. He spoke of attitudes and functions combining to create distinct personality structures. An introverted thinking type would approach the world differently than an extroverted feeling type. This framework offered a way to understand the fundamental differences in how people perceive and judge reality. Yet Jung's typology, brilliant as it was, remained somewhat abstract. He spoke of functions in philosophical terms, exploring their manifestations in historical figures and his patients. The system was rich, but difficult to operationalize. How did these functions actually work together? What happened when the dominant function met resistance? How did the shadow functions manifest in daily life? Jung himself recognized the limitations. In his autobiography, Memories, Dreams, Reflections, he acknowledged that typology was merely an orientation tool, a rough map of territories that remained largely unexplored. He warned against using it rigidly, treating people as fixed categories rather than fluid processes. This was the landscape that existed when John Beebe entered the world of Jungian psychology decades later. Born in 1939 in Washington, D.C., Beebe came of age in the middle decades of the 20th century, a time when Jung's ideas were spreading beyond their European origins into American soil. The post-war era saw a flowering of interest in depth psychology, particularly among those who found Freud's drive theory too reductive and behavioral psychology too mechanical. Jung offered something different, a vision of the psyche as inherently meaningful, populated by archetypal forces that connected individual experience to universal patterns. Beebe's path to psychology was not direct. He studied medicine at the University of Chicago, graduating in 1963, and completed psychiatric training at Stanford. He was drawn to the healing professions, to the intimate work of understanding troubled minds and guiding them toward wholeness. But it was his encounter with Jungian analysis, both as a patient and a student, that set the course of his life's work. In his own analysis, Beebe experienced the transformative power of engaging with dreams, symbols, and the unconscious. He trained at the C.G. Jung Institute in San Francisco, becoming part of the first generation of American analysts to carry Jung's torch in the New World. But Beebe, like many of his generation, found himself wrestling with Jung's typology. It was clearly onto something profound, but it seemed incomplete. People didn't just operate from their dominant function. In the give and take of daily life, other functions emerged, sometimes helpfully, sometimes sabotaging. A person's inferior function didn't simply lurk in shadow. It erupted at inconvenient moments, causing embarrassment and conflict. And there were patterns to these eruptions, archetypal qualities that gave them recognizable form. Beebe's genius was to take Jung's typological system and infuse it with the dynamism of archetypal theory. If Jung had mapped the terrain, Beebe populated it with living figures. He asked, what if each of the 8 functions, the 4 in their extroverted and introverted forms, was associated with a specific archetype? What if these archetypes followed a predictable sequence, creating a kind of internal cast of characters? This question, simple yet revolutionary, would occupy Beebe for decades and transform how Jungian analysts understood personality. The cultural context of Beebe's development matters deeply to understanding his contribution. By the time he was fully engaged with developing his model in the 1980s and 90s, Jung's typology had taken on a life beyond clinical psychology. The Myers-Briggs Type Indicator, developed by Isabel Briggs Myers and her mother Catherine Cook Briggs, had become wildly popular in corporate and educational settings. Based loosely on Jung's theory, but modified and simplified, the MBTI introduced millions to the idea of personality types. Suddenly, people were identifying as INTJs or ESFPs using 4-letter codes to explain themselves. This popularization was both a blessing and a problem. On one hand, it brought Jungian ideas to a vast audience. On the other, it risked reducing Jung's subtle framework to a parlor game, a way to stereotype oneself and others. Beebe found himself in an interesting position. He was a clinically trained Jungian analyst, steeped in depth psychology's commitment to the unconscious and individuation. Yet he was also fascinated by typology and its practical applications. How could he honor both the depth of Jung's vision and the lived reality of how types manifested? Beebe's answer was to return to Jung's own method, amplification through archetypal lenses. Jung had taught that everything in the psyche could be understood through archetypal patterns, those universal structures that appeared in myths, fairy tales, and dreams across cultures. The mother archetype, the hero archetype, the trickster, these were not just interesting ideas, but fundamental, organizing principles of consciousness. Why not apply the same archetypal thinking to the functions themselves? This insight crystallized for Beebe through clinical work and his own self-observation. He noticed that when people used their dominant function, they had a heroic quality. The dominant function was the hero of consciousness, the aspect of personality that faced the world with confidence and competence. An introverted intuitive type, for instance, wielded their introverted intuition like a hero's sword, cutting through surface appearances to perceive hidden meanings. This was their strength, their gift, the function they trusted most. But what of the auxiliary function, the second function that supported the hero? Beebe noticed it had a parental quality, offering wisdom and care, helping the dominant function stay grounded and effective. The tertiary function, less developed, seemed to have a childlike quality, playful, spontaneous, but also vulnerable and easily wounded. And the inferior function, the fourth in Jung's original scheme, clearly had an anima or animus quality, dwelling in shadow, representing the contrasexual aspect of the personality, both attractive and frightening. This was already expanding Jung's framework in useful ways, but Beebe realized the story didn't end with 4 functions. Jung had spoken of 8 functions total, 4 in their extroverted form and 4 in their introverted form. If a person's dominant function was introverted intuition, what happened to extroverted intuition? It couldn't simply disappear. Beebe proposed that it took on a shadowy archetypal form, specifically the opposing personality. This function opposed the hero, challenging its dominance, often experienced as the inner critic or devil's advocate. Similarly, the shadow form of the auxiliary became the critical parent or senex figure, offering harsh judgment rather than supportive wisdom. The shadow of the tertiary became the trickster, creating mischief and chaos when least expected, and the shadow of the inferior became the demon or daimonic figure, the most deeply unconscious aspect, capable of both destructive eruption and, if integrated, profound wisdom. With this 8-function, 8-archetype model, Beebe had created something new while remaining deeply Jungian. He had taken Jung's typological skeleton and given it flesh, transforming static categories into a dynamic drama of archetypal figures interacting within the psyche. This wasn't just theory for theory's sake. It offered practicing analysts and individuals on the path of self-understanding a way to recognize and work with the different parts of themselves. To understand how profound this shift was, we need to linger in the space between Jung's original vision and Beebe's elaboration. Jung saw typology primarily as a way to understand consciousness, particularly the conscious orientation toward the world. The dominant function was like a lens through which reality was filtered. If you were a thinking type, you naturally sought logical explanations. If you were a feeling type, you naturally sought value and meaning. This made intuitive sense and matched clinical observation. But Jung was less clear about how the other functions operated. The auxiliary helped the dominant, yes, but how exactly? The tertiary and inferior were less developed, trapped in a more primitive state. But what did that mean in practice? Jung's answers were often abstract, philosophical. He would point to historical examples or mythological figures to illustrate, but the practical, psychological mechanics remained somewhat mysterious. Beebe brought a narrative clarity to these mechanics. By assigning each function an archetypal role, he made it possible to predict and recognize patterns. If someone's dominant function was extroverted thinking, their hero was the logical analyzer, ordering the external world through rational categories. Their auxiliary, introverted intuition, played the supporting parent role, offering insights and hunches that kept the thinking flexible and adaptive. Their tertiary, extroverted feeling was the pure, or puella, the eternal child, enthusiastic about connecting with others, but also naive and easily hurt in matters of relationship. Their inferior, introverted sensation was the anima, or animus, the mysterious depth that could flood them with sensory overwhelm, or in moments of integration, offer profound groundedness. And the shadow functions? The opposing personality, introverted thinking, would critique and second-guess, asking, "But are you really being logical? Have you considered the internal logical consistency?" The critical parent, extroverted intuition, would say, "You're missing all the possibilities. You're too narrow." The trickster, introverted feeling, would create chaos in values and self-understanding, and the demon, extroverted sensation, could manifest as destructive sensory indulgence or, in rare, integrated moments, as a gift for being fully present in the body and world. This is dense material, and if you're feeling your eyelids grow heavy, let them. There's no need to grasp every detail tonight. The architecture of the psyche is vast, and we have all the time in the world to explore its many rooms. What matters now is the feeling of the conversation between Jung and Beebe, the way one man's foundation became another's cathedral. Jung spent his life exploring the collective unconscious, the shared reservoir of archetypal images and patterns that connected all humans across time and space. He dove into mythology, alchemy, Gnosticism, and world religions, seeking evidence of these universal patterns. His consulting room was filled with artifacts from ancient cultures, tangible reminders that the psyche was not a modern invention but an ancient, layered entity. Beebe's approach was more intimate, more focused on the individual's experience of their own internal cast of characters. While Jung asked, "What universal patterns appear across all humans?" Beebe asked, "How do these universal patterns arrange themselves uniquely in each person, creating predictable dynamics?" This was not a rejection of Jung, but a loving refinement, a way to make the vast territories of analytical psychology navigable for people trying to understand why they struggled with certain situations or related to certain people. Think of it this way. Jung gave us a map of the ocean, showing the great currents and depths. Beebe gave us a compass and a sailing manual, showing how to navigate those waters depending on what kind of vessel you were sailing. Both are necessary. Both honor the mystery of the journey while offering practical guidance. As Beebe developed his model through the 1980s and 90s, he tested it against clinical experience. He worked with patients struggling with relationships, career decisions, and existential questions. He noticed how understanding their functional stack, the order and archetypal role of their 8 functions, shed light on recurring patterns. Why did a particular client always fall into destructive relationships? Because their trickster function was sabotaging their attempts at intimacy, creating chaos just when connection seemed possible. Why did another client struggle with authority? Because their critical parent was harshly judging them through the lens of a shadow function, creating internal conflict that projected outward. This was practical Jungian work, but it went beyond symptom relief. Beebe remained committed to Jung's larger vision of individuation, the lifelong process of becoming whole by integrating unconscious contents into consciousness. The eight-function model was a tool for individuation, a way to recognize which parts of the psyche needed attention. If you could identify your inferior function and its animus quality, you could begin the delicate work of relating to it, learning from it, allowing it to transform from enemy to ally. Jung had written extensively about the anima and animus, the contrasexual archetypes that mediated between ego and unconscious. For a man, the anima appeared as feminine figures in dreams and fantasies, representing his connection to eros, relationship, and the unconscious. For a woman, the animus appeared as masculine figures, representing logos, judgment, and assertion. These were not literal gender roles, but psychological principles that could manifest through either biological sex. Beebe's innovation was to locate the animus, specifically in the inferior function. This gave the abstract concept concrete grounding. If you were an extroverted thinking type, your anima dwelled in introverted feeling. This inferior feeling function had all the qualities Jung described. It was fascinating and terrifying. It could overwhelm you with emotions you couldn't control. It seemed alien and yet deeply important. And it mediated between your conscious ego and the deeper layers of the unconscious. By understanding your inferior function as your anima or animus, you had a specific place to direct your attention, a specific relationship to cultivate. The other shadow functions, the opposing personality, critical parent, and trickster, also took on new meaning through Beebe's model. Jung had written about the shadow as the repressed or undeveloped aspects of personality, often projected onto others. We see in others what we cannot acknowledge in ourselves. Beebe showed how different functions carried different shadow qualities. The opposing personality was the inner critic that used a shadow version of your dominant function against you. The critical parent was the harsh judge that eroded your confidence. The trickster was the saboteur that undermined your best intentions. Recognizing these archetypal roles didn't make them disappear, but it changed the relationship. Instead of being blindsided by your trickster's mischief, you could recognize its signature and perhaps even learn to work with it. Instead of being crushed by your critical parent's judgment, you could identify its voice and question whether its criticisms were accurate or distorted. This was shadow work, made specific, grounded in the actual structure of personality, rather than abstract moralizing about acknowledging one's dark side. Jung's concept of the shadow was always more nuanced than popular psychology suggests. He didn't simply mean the bad or evil parts of ourselves. The shadow contained all that was unconscious, including positive qualities we hadn't claimed. A person might repress their creativity, their assertiveness, their capacity for joy. These too dwelled in shadow. And the shadow was both personal, containing repressed individual experiences, and collective, connected to the darker aspects of human nature that all people share. Beebe honored this complexity while adding structure. Each shadow function had its own archetypal quality and its own potential for both harm and healing. The opposing personality could be a harsh critic, but it could also offer valuable perspective, challenging the dominant function's blind spots. The critical parent could wound, but it also carried wisdom about what not to do. The trickster could sabotage, but it also brought humor and the ability to shift perspective. Even the demon, the deepest shadow function, could transform from destroyer to guardian if approached with courage and respect. This transformation of shadow functions was central to Beebe's vision of individuation. Jung had emphasized the need to integrate the shadow, to make the unconscious conscious. Beebe showed how this happened through the functions. As you developed your tertiary function, as you learned to relate to your inferior function, as you recognized and dialogued with your shadow functions, you were doing the work of individuation. You were becoming more whole, more flexible, more able to respond to life's complexity. The eight-function model also illuminated interpersonal dynamics in ways Jung's original typology only hinted at. Jung had observed that types complemented each other. An extroverted feeling type might be drawn to an introverted thinking type, each providing what the other lacked. But why did these relationships so often become conflicted? Why did the initial attraction turn to frustration? Beebe's model offered answers. When two people related, their functions interacted in complex ways. Your dominant function might clash with another's opposing personality. Your critical parent might attack through the very function that was their tertiary child, wounding them deeply. Your trickster might trigger their demon, leading to explosive conflict. By understanding the archetypal roles at play, you could depersonalize the conflict, recognizing that it wasn't about character flaws, but about functions colliding. This didn't solve all interpersonal problems, but it provided a framework for understanding and dialogue. Instead of saying, "You're too critical," you might recognize, "Your critical parent is interacting with my tertiary child, and it hurts because that function is vulnerable for me." This language shift, from personal attack to functional analysis, could diffuse conflict and open space for compassion. Jung had always emphasized the importance of typology in analysis itself. He needed to understand his patient's type to know how to approach them. A thinking type needed logical explanations. A feeling type needed value-based connection. An intuitive type engaged with symbols naturally. A sensation type needed concrete grounding. But Jung's framework didn't tell the analyst how their own type might be interacting with the patients. This was left to intuition and experience. Beebe brought the analyst's type into the picture. He showed how the analyst's functions would resonate or clash with the patient's, creating transference and countertransference dynamics that could be understood typologically. If the analyst's dominant function matched the patient's inferior function, for instance, the analyst might naturally offer what the patient most needed to develop. But the analyst had to be careful not to overwhelm the patient's vulnerable function. If the analyst's critical parent attacked through the patient's tertiary child, healing would be impossible. This made Jungian analysis more self-aware, more reflexive. The analyst wasn't a blank screen, as in classical Freudian analysis, but a full person whose type influenced the therapeutic relationship. By understanding these dynamics, the analyst could work more skillfully, adapting their approach to honor both their own authentic type and the patient's needs. Let your breathing slow now, falling into the natural rhythm of rest. Feel how these ideas, dense and intricate as they are, weave a web of understanding around the mystery of who we are. Jung and Beebe, separated by decades and contexts, are speaking to each other through the night, their voices blending into a conversation about the architecture of consciousness. Jung spent much of his later life refining his understanding of archetypes. In his essay, The Archetypes and the Collective Unconscious, he described them as forms without content, patterns that structured experience but didn't determine it. The mother archetype, for instance, wasn't any particular mother, but the pattern of mothering that appeared across all cultures, nurturing, protecting, devouring, renewing. Archetypes were potentials, activated by personal and cultural circumstances, taking on specific images and meanings. Beebe applied this archetypal thinking directly to the functions. The hero archetype was the pattern of facing challenges with your greatest strength. The parent archetype was the pattern of offering guidance and support. The child archetype was the pattern of innocence and playfulness. The anima, or animus, was the pattern of encountering the other within yourself. The opposing personality was the pattern of internal conflict. The senex, or critical parent, was the pattern of harsh judgment. The trickster was the pattern of chaos and reversal. The demon was the pattern of destructive power and ultimate wisdom. By linking functions to archetypes, Beebe made typology mythological. Each person's type became a personal myth, a story with recurring characters and themes. This resonated deeply with Jung's belief that the psyche was inherently mythological, that we lived our lives according to archetypal patterns, whether we knew it or not. Beebe was simply making the specific patterns of each type explicit. This mythological dimension gave Beebe's work a richness that went beyond personality assessment. It wasn't just about knowing your four-letter type. It was about understanding your internal cast of characters, recognizing when the hero was struggling, when the child was wounded, when the trickster was undermining, when the demon was threatening to erupt. This was self-knowledge in the deepest sense, the kind Jung had always advocated. Beebe also connected his typological work to the broader tradition of archetypal psychology that had emerged through James Hillman and others in the late 20th century. Hillman had emphasized the multiplicity of the psyche, the idea that we're not a single unified self but a community of part selves, each with its own perspective and needs. This polytheistic view of the psyche challenged the Freudian emphasis on ego supremacy and even questioned Jung's focus on the self as the organizing center. Beebe's 8-function model fit beautifully with this polytheistic vision while remaining fundamentally Jungian. Yes, the psyche contained multiple voices and perspectives, 8 archetypal function complexes, in fact. But this didn't mean chaos. The functions were arranged in a specific order, creating a functional stack that gave personality its characteristic shape, and the ego, operating through the dominant and auxiliary functions, still had the task of relating to and integrating the other functions. Beebe was honoring multiplicity within structure, diversity within order. This balance between unity and multiplicity was very Jungian. Jung had always emphasized the paradoxical nature of the psyche. We are one and many, conscious and unconscious, individual and collective. The self, that organizing center and totality of the psyche, held all the opposites together. Individuation meant moving toward the self, becoming more whole by including more of the psyche's diversity and consciousness. Beebe's model served this individuating process. By recognizing your 8-function archetypes, you were acknowledging the full community of your inner life. You weren't just your hero function. You were also your parent, your child, your anima or animus, and yes, your shadow functions too. Individuation meant learning to relate to all of these voices, allowing them to inform consciousness without being overwhelmed by them. The question of consciousness was central to both Jung and Beebe. Jung had spent his life trying to understand how consciousness emerged from the unconscious, how ego developed out of the primal soup of archetypal potentials. He saw consciousness as hard-won, fragile, always threatened by the unconscious's overwhelming power. The unconscious wasn't just personal memories, but the vast collective psyche, containing all of human experience, all the gods and demons of mythology, all the potentials and dangers that consciousness couldn't control. Ego consciousness, for Jung, had a specific task: to maintain awareness, to differentiate itself from the unconscious while remaining in relationship with it. An ego that was too weak would be flooded by unconscious contents, leading to psychosis. An ego that was too rigid would be cut off from the unconscious's creative and renewing powers, leading to sterility and neurosis. The healthy ego was strong yet flexible, differentiated yet permeable. Beebe's typological model described how ego consciousness actually operated through the functions. The dominant function was the primary tool of consciousness, the way ego engaged with reality most confidently. The auxiliaries supported this engagement, adding nuance and balance. Together, these two functions formed the conscious attitude, the face you presented to the world. The tertiary and inferior functions were more unconscious, more difficult to access and control, but still part of your personal psyche. The shadow functions were even deeper, usually completely unconscious, until brought to awareness through conflict or self-reflection. This layered understanding of consciousness honored Jung's insights while making them more precise. Consciousness wasn't a monolithic state, but a spectrum, with some functions more conscious and developed than others. Individuation meant expanding consciousness down the functional stack, developing the tertiary, learning to relate to the inferior, and recognizing the shadow functions when they emerged. But how did this expansion happen? Jung had emphasized the role of dreams, active imagination, and analysis itself as tools for making the unconscious conscious. Dreams presented unconscious contents in symbolic form. Active imagination allowed direct dialogue with unconscious figures. Analysis provided a relationship within which unconscious material could be safely explored. Beebe honored all of these approaches while adding typological awareness as another tool. By understanding your functional stack, you could recognize which parts of the psyche were trying to speak through dreams and symptoms. If your inferior function appeared in a dream, you knew you were being called to develop that aspect of yourself. If your trickster was acting up in daily life, you knew shadow work was needed. The model provided a diagnostic tool that complemented Jung's symbolic approach. This complementarity was important. Beebe never suggested that typology replaced Jung's symbolic method. He knew that symbols carried meanings that couldn't be reduced to typological categories. A dream of a wise old man might relate to the Senex archetype in your functional stack, but it also carried the full weight of the archetypal wise old man as Jung had described, the spiritual principle, the connection to meaning and purpose, the voice of ancestral wisdom. Typology could help locate where this archetype was constellated in your psyche, but it didn't exhaust the symbol's meaning. This respect for symbol and mystery was deeply Jungian. Jung had always resisted reducing psyche to system. He knew that every system was provisional, a map that couldn't capture the territory's full richness. He created his typological system reluctantly, almost apologetically, knowing it would be misused to stereotype and categorize. But he also knew it was useful, that it helped people understand fundamental differences in perspective and approach. Beebe inherited this tension and embraced it. He developed his 8-function model rigorously, testing it against clinical experience, refining the archetypal assignments, exploring the implications. But he also held it lightly, knowing it was a tool, not the truth. In his writings and lectures, he often emphasized that typology should serve individuation, not replace it. The point wasn't to figure out your type and then stop exploring. The point was to use type awareness to deepen self-understanding and expand consciousness. This humility about his own contribution was characteristic of Beebe. He always positioned himself as continuing Jung's work, not replacing it. He saw his model as answering questions Jung had raised, but not fully resolved. Jung had given the 8 functions. Beebe had clarified their relationship. Jung had emphasized shadow. Beebe had shown how shadow operated through function pairs. Jung had spoken of anima and animus. Beebe had located them in the inferior function. This was elaboration, not revision. And yet, the elaboration was so significant that it transformed typology from an interesting but somewhat static framework into a dynamic model of personality development. Jung's original typology could tell you your orientation and dominant function, but it was less clear about growth and change. How did a thinking type develop feeling? How did an intuitive type become more grounded in sensation? Jung's answer was usually some version of through suffering and experience, which was true but not very specific. Beebe's answer was more concrete. You developed your functions in order down the stack. First, you strengthened your dominant hero function, becoming more skilled and confident in your primary mode of engagement. Then you developed your auxiliary parent, adding wisdom and balance. In midlife, if you were fortunate and attentive, you began developing your tertiary child, reclaiming the playful innocence that had been wounded or neglected. And throughout life, you were called to relate to your inferior anima or animus, learning to honor what you had rejected as weak or alien. The shadow functions developed differently. You didn't so much develop them as recognize and integrate them. The opposing personality needed to be acknowledged as your inner critic, sometimes offering valid perspective, sometimes attacking unfairly. The critical parent needed to be compassionately understood as a wounded version of your auxiliary, harsh because it feared you would fail. The trickster needed to be befriended as the chaotic but creative force that prevented rigidity. And the demon needed to be approached with utmost respect as both destroyer and guardian of the deepest self. This developmental sequence gave people a roadmap for growth that was rooted in their own specific type. An INFJ's journey would differ from an ESTP's, but both would follow the same archetypal pattern, strengthening the hero, honoring the parent, healing the child, engaging the anima, recognizing the opposing personality, understanding the critical parent, befriending the trickster, and, if grace allowed, meeting the demon. Jung had spoken of individuation as the central task of the second half of life. In the first half, you built ego, established yourself in the world, developed your conscious personality. In the second half, you turned inward, confronting what you had rejected, integrating shadow, moving toward wholeness. This was the heroic journey of consciousness, archetypal and universal. Beebe's model showed how this journey unfolded typologically. The first half of life was dominated by the hero and parent functions, building competence and stability. The second half brought attention to the child and anima functions, healing wounds and embracing what had been exiled. The shadow functions emerged throughout life, but became more insistent in midlife, demanding recognition and integration. This vision honored Jung's developmental framework while making it specific to individual types. It also connected to the archetypal journey of the hero, which Jung had explored extensively through mythology and fairy tales. The hero sets out from home, faces trials, descends to the underworld, confronts death or the monster, and returns transformed with the boon. This pattern appeared in every culture because it reflected the universal pattern of consciousness development. Beebe showed how each type lived this journey differently. The extroverted thinking hero faced different trials than the introverted feeling hero. The ENTP's descent into the underworld meant confronting introverted sensation, the demon function that brought bodily awareness and mortality. The ISFP's descent meant confronting extroverted thinking, the demon that organized and controlled in ways that felt alien to their value-based spontaneity. Same archetypal journey, different functional terrain. Now let yourself sink deeper into rest, feeling the weight of your body against the bed, the darkness behind your eyelids. These ideas are intricate, yes, but they point to something simple, the recognition that you are not one thing, but many, not fixed, but unfolding. Jung knew this. Beebe refined it. And together, their insights create a space where self-understanding becomes possible. One of the most valuable aspects of Beebe's work was how it helped explain conflict, both internal and interpersonal. Jung had recognized that psychological conflict often arose from the clash of opposites within the psyche. The conscious attitude developed in one direction while the unconscious compensated in the opposite direction, creating tension. If you identified too strongly with logic and reason, your unconscious would erupt with irrational emotions. If you focused entirely on external achievement, your inner world would demand attention through dreams and symptoms. Beebe's model made this compensatory relationship explicit through function pairs. Your dominant function had a shadow version in the opposing personality. Your auxiliary had a shadow in the critical parent. Your tertiary had a shadow in the trickster. Your inferior had a shadow in the demon. These shadow functions weren't just undeveloped. They actively opposed the conscious attitude, creating internal conflict. Understanding this opposition changed how you related to internal conflict. Instead of seeing yourself as weak or flawed when your shadow functions emerged, you could recognize them as necessary counterweights, attempting to balance a one-sided conscious attitude. Your opposing personality wasn't trying to destroy you. It was trying to add perspective that your hero function missed. Your critical parent wasn't purely destructive. It was trying to protect you from mistakes, albeit in a harsh way. Your trickster wasn't evil. It was trying to inject chaos into an overly rigid approach. Even your demon wasn't purely negative. It guarded the treasure of your deepest unconscious function, which, if claimed, could transform your life. This reframe was therapeutic. It moved conflict from the moral register, good versus evil, strength versus weakness, to the functional register, different parts of the psyche serving different needs, sometimes cooperating, sometimes clashing, but all part of the whole. This was very Jungian. Jung had always emphasized that the psyche was self-regulating, that symptoms and conflicts weren't just problems to eliminate, but messages to decode. Beebe also illuminated interpersonal conflict through the model. When two people clashed, it was often because their functions were in opposition. Your hero might trigger their demon, creating intense emotional reactions. Your critical parent might attack through their wounded child, causing deep pain. Your trickster might destabilize their carefully constructed order. By understanding these functional dynamics, you could depersonalize conflict, recognizing that the clash wasn't about character, but about incompatible functions colliding. This didn't mean that functional incompatibility doomed relationships. Quite the opposite. Jung had emphasized that relationships were crucibles for individuation, forcing us to confront what we'd rather avoid. Beebe's model showed how this worked practically. When your partner's dominant function triggered your demon, you were being called to develop that deepest shadow function. When your child was wounded by their critical parent, you were learning to protect and nurture your vulnerable function. Relationship friction was functional development in action. This view of relationship was both realistic and hopeful. It acknowledged the genuine difficulty of human connection while framing that difficulty as opportunity Jung had. Written about the conjunctio, the sacred marriage of opposites, as the ultimate goal of individuation. This wasn't primarily about outer marriage, but about the internal union of masculine and feminine, conscious and unconscious, ego and self. But outer relationships mirrored and facilitated this inner work. By struggling with the other, you learn to integrate your own otherness. Beebe's typological lens made this abstract concept concrete. The other person literally carried different functions in different positions. What was their hero might be your demon. What was their child might be your critical parent. By recognizing these differences structurally, you could develop compassion and strategy. You could learn to speak to their hero, avoid triggering their demon, protect their child, and challenge their trickster playfully rather than confrontationally. This brings us to one of Beebe's most important contributions, translating Jungian ideas into relational patterns. Jung's work was often focused on the individual psyche and its relationship to the collective unconscious. While he wrote about transference, marriage, and social dynamics, his primary lens was intrapsychic. Beebe made typology interpersonal, showing how the internal drama of the 8 functions played out between people. This was particularly valuable for understanding projection, that most Jungian of mechanisms. Jung had explained that we project onto others what we can't see in ourselves, especially shadow contents. We perceive in another person qualities that actually belong to our own unconscious. The angry person we condemn carries our own unacknowledged aggression. The saintly person we admire carries our own unclaimed virtue. Beebe showed how projection operated functionally. You tended to project your inferior and shadow functions onto others. If introverted feeling was your inferior function, you might be fascinated or repelled by people who led with introverted feeling. They seemed mysterious, authentic, and disturbing, everything your dominant function wasn't. Similarly, if extroverted intuition was your opposing personality, you might criticize others for being too scattered and possibility-focused, not recognizing that this was your own shadow function judging them. Recognizing these functional projections allowed you to reclaim your projections more consciously. Instead of simply admiring or condemning the other, you could ask, what aspect of my functional stack am I seeing in them? What is trying to become conscious through this encounter? This was shadow work made practical, grounded in the specific structure of your type. Jung had developed active imagination as a technique for engaging unconscious contents directly. You would enter a meditative state and allow images, figures, or voices to emerge from the unconscious. Then you would dialogue with them, asking questions, receiving responses, gradually building a relationship with the unconscious. This was not passive fantasy, but active engagement, requiring ego consciousness to remain present and responsive. Beebe applied this technique to the function archetypes. You could actively imagine your critical parent, asking why it was so harsh, what it needed, what wisdom it carried. You could dialogue with your trickster, understanding its motivations and making peace with its chaos. You could approach your demon respectfully, seeking its guardian aspect rather than fleeing its destructive power. This personification of the functions made them more accessible, more workable. This technique bridged Jung's symbolic approach and modern cognitive behavioral strategies. By externalizing the functions as imaginal figures, you created distance from them, gaining perspective. You weren't your critical parent. You had a critical parent that spoke through your shadow auxiliary function. This distinction was liberating. It allowed you to observe the function's behavior, understand its patterns, and choose whether to believe its judgments. And yet this was not merely cognitive reframing. Beebe remained committed to the Jungian belief that these figures were autonomous, arising from the objective psyche, not simply invented by ego. The critical parent, once personified through active imagination, could surprise you with its responses. It had its own perspective, its own wounds, its own wisdom. This autonomy indicated that you were engaging genuine unconscious contents, not just playing mental games. Jung had emphasized the numinous quality of the unconscious, its ability to overwhelm ego consciousness with its power and meaning. Encounters with the self, with archetypal images, with a transpersonal dimension of psyche, carried a sacred quality. They couldn't be controlled or manipulated. They demanded respect and humility. Beebe honored this numinosity, particularly in relation to the demon function. The eighth function, the shadow of the inferior, was the gateway to both destruction and transformation. When constellated negatively, it could destroy relationships, careers, health. It emerged as compulsive behavior, blinding rage, or paralyzing shame. But when approached consciously, with courage and respect, it could become the daimon in the ancient Greek sense, the guardian spirit that connected individual life to divine purpose. This redemptive possibility for even the deepest shadow function was quintessentially Jungian. Jung had always insisted that every complex, every symptom, every shadow element carried potential for healing and wholeness. The psyche was teleological, aimed at individuation. What seemed destructive was often the psyche's attempt to restore balance, to force attention to neglected aspects, to initiate transformation. Beebe's demon function exemplified this principle. The very function that could destroy you also guarded your deepest potential. For the extroverted thinking type, the demon was introverted sensation grounding, in body, in present moment, in mortality. When unconscious, it could manifest as illness, addiction, sensory overwhelm, but when integrated, it brought acceptance of limitation, presence, and peace. For the introverted feeling type, the demon was extroverted logic organizing, systematizing, categorizing. When unconscious, it could manifest as harsh judgment, rigid thinking, loss of nuance. But when integrated, it brought structure to values, making ethical principles communicable and actionable. The journey to the demon was the deepest form of individuation in Beebe's model. It usually happened in life's final chapters, if at all. It required confronting everything you'd rejected about yourself, everything your ego identity depended on not being. But those who made this journey reported profound transformation, a sense of coming home to themselves in a new way. Jung's own journey illustrated this pattern. His dominant function was likely introverted intuition, perceiving archetypal patterns and meanings beneath surface appearances. This was his gift, allowing him to dive deep into the collective unconscious and return with insights. But his demon, by Beebe's model, would have been extroverted sensation, full presence in the external sensory world, acceptance of concrete reality as it is. In his early life, Jung struggled with this function. He was often abstract, lost in his inner visions, disconnected from simple physical reality. His break with Freud precipitated a descent into the unconscious that lasted years, a confrontation with his own depths that could have destroyed him, but he emerged with a different relationship to reality. He built his tower at Bollingen, stone by stone, with his own hands, engaging extroverted sensation directly. He carved figures from stone, worked with his hands, connected to earth and body in ways that grounded his vast intuitive explorations. This integration of his demon function didn't eliminate his intuitive gifts, it earthed them, making them more accessible and less overwhelming. His later work had a different quality, less apocalyptic, more grounded, though still profound. He had completed a full journey through his functional stack, claiming even his deepest shadow function. Beebe saw similar patterns in his patience and analysans. The journey to wholeness required engaging all 8 functions. Not becoming equally skilled with all of them that was impossible, but recognizing them, respecting them, allowing them to inform consciousness. This was individuation as Jung had conceived it, not perfection but wholeness, including light and shadow, strength and weakness, consciousness and unconscious. The language Jung and Beebe used to describe this process differed in emphasis, but not in essence. Jung spoke symbolically, mythologically, using images of descent and rebirth, death and resurrection. He drew on alchemy's nigredo and albedo, on the hero's journey, on the coniunctio. His language was poetic, evocative, aimed at the imaginal faculty. Beebe spoke structurally, typologically, using the precise language of functions and archetypes. He created diagrams showing the functional stack, used clear terms like opposing personality and critical parent, aimed at conceptual understanding. His language was more accessible, less mystical, but it pointed to the same realities Jung described. This difference in language reflected their different contexts and gifts. Jung was a visionary, breaking new ground, trying to articulate experiences and insights that had no established vocabulary. He had to invent his language, drawing on myth and philosophy because psychology hadn't developed terms adequate to his vision. His writing was often dense, circuitous, frustrating to readers who wanted clarity. Beebe was a clarifier, working within a developed Jungian tradition, able to use established concepts and refine them. He could afford to be more precise because Jung had already done the visionary work. His contribution was to make that vision operationalizable, to show how it worked in practice, to give people tools they could actually use. This complementarity between visionary and clarifier appears throughout intellectual history. Darwin articulated evolution. Later biologists clarified the mechanisms. Freud discovered the unconscious. Later analysts developed specific techniques. Jung mapped the collective unconscious. Later Jungians like Beebe showed how those maps applied to individual lives. Neither role is superior. Both are necessary. And in the quiet of this exploration, as your breath grows deeper and more regular, you might sense how these two minds are aspects of a larger mind, the collective attempt to understand consciousness itself. Jung and Beebe are not separate competitors, but collaborators across time, each contributing what their gifts and contexts allowed, building a gradually more complete picture of the psyche's architecture. One area where Beebe significantly extended Jung's work was in understanding cognitive functions in conflict situations. Jung had noted that psychological type could be a source of misunderstanding between people. A thinking type might feel that a feeling type was illogical and overly emotional. A feeling type might feel that a thinking type was cold and insensitive. But Jung didn't develop a detailed analysis of these conflicts, beyond noting that they arose from different functional orientations. Beebe provided that analysis. He showed how specific functions in specific archetypal positions interacted predictably. When one person's hero function confronted another's opposing personality, there was often instant friction. The hero was trying to do what it did best, but the opposing personality experienced this as threatening or wrong, triggering defensive criticism. For example, imagine an INTJ whose hero function is introverted intuition, always seeking the underlying pattern and meaning. They interact with an ESFP whose opposing personality is introverted intuition, experienced as the part of themselves that gets lost in dark, pessimistic future thinking. When the INTJ shares their intuitive insights, the ESFP might react with surprising hostility, not because the insights are wrong, but because they trigger the ESFP's shadow function, which they associate with anxiety and disconnection from present joy. Neither person is being deliberately difficult. They're experiencing a functional collision. The INTJ is innocently using their hero function. The ESFP is having their opposing personality activated. With typological awareness, both can step back and depersonalize the reaction. The INTJ can recognize that they're triggering a shadow function and adjust their approach. The ESFP can recognize that their strong reaction is coming from their opposing personality, not from objective assessment of the INTJ's ideas. This kind of typological awareness creates space for relationship and dialogue that might otherwise be impossible. It transforms "you're doing something wrong" into "we're wired differently, and we can learn to work with that." This is immensely practical for couples, families, work teams, and any context where people of different types need to cooperate. Beebe also explored how the critical parent function caused particular damage in relationships. Because the critical parent operates through the shadow of the auxiliary function, it attacks in the area where a person should receive support and wisdom. If your auxiliary is extroverted thinking, which should organize and structure your inner vision, your critical parent is introverted thinking, which harshly criticizes your internal logic for not being good enough. When someone else's dominant function matches your critical parent function, they can inadvertently trigger your self-doubt. An INTP whose dominant function is introverted thinking might offer their logical analysis innocently, but if that's your critical parent function, you'll hear it as harsh criticism, confirming your worst fears about your inadequacy. The INTP isn't attacking you, they're just being themselves. But the functional overlap means their natural behavior resonates with your internal critic. Again, awareness transforms the dynamic. If you recognize that you have a harsh, introverted thinking critical parent, you can notice when it's being triggered by someone else's introverted thinking. You can differentiate between their actual message and your internal critic's distortion. You can tell yourself, "This is my critical parent being activated," not necessarily what they're saying. This self-awareness prevents you from either shutting down in shame or lashing out defensively. The trickster function Beebe identified as the seventh function, the shadow of the tertiary, explaining much about seemingly random acts of self-sabotage. The trickster emerges when You're trying to use your tertiary function, but it goes sideways, creating chaos and embarrassment. Because the tertiary is already vulnerable and childlike, its shadow is particularly mischievous. Jung had written extensively about the trickster archetype in mythology and folklore. Figures like Loki, Coyote, Hermes, and Anansi appeared across cultures as boundary crossers, rule breakers, and agents of chaos. But they weren't simply evil. They were necessary, breaking up rigid structures, introducing creativity and change, reminding humans not to take themselves too seriously. The trickster served the larger process of renewal and transformation, even through disruption. Beebe localized this archetype in the functional stack, showing when and how it emerged personally. If your tertiary function is introverted feeling, your trickster is extroverted feeling. You might be trying to connect warmly with someone using your vulnerable tertiary function, but your trickster makes you say the exactly wrong thing, offending them. Or you might be navigating a social situation that requires extroverted feeling awareness, but your trickster makes you oblivious, leading to social disasters. These trickster moments are intensely embarrassing in the moment, but often humorous in retrospect. The trickster deflates ego inflation, prevents the conscious attitude from becoming too rigid, injects humility. Befriending your trickster means learning to laugh at yourself, recognizing that you will periodically do things that make no sense, that undermine your conscious intentions. This acceptance is part of individuation, the recognition that you're not in complete control, that the psyche has its own agenda. Jung's concept of synchronicity, meaningful coincidence, also relates to the trickster principle. Synchronicities occur when outer events mirror inner psychic states in ways that seem impossible by ordinary causation. You're thinking of someone, and they call. You're wrestling with a question, and you randomly open a book to a passage that answers it. Jung believed these occurrences revealed the psychoid nature of the unconscious, its ability to influence not just inner experience but outer reality. Beebe's trickster function participates in this psychoid realm. The trickster's mischief often has a synchronistic quality, creating accidents that reveal something important. You meant to go one place but accidentally go somewhere else, where you encounter exactly what you needed. You meant to say one thing but slip and say something else, which turns out to be truer. The trickster operates at the boundary between conscious intention and unconscious wisdom, between ego control and psychic guidance. This liminal quality of the trickster makes it both frustrating and valuable. You can't control it, that's the point. It serves a wisdom deeper than ego consciousness, even when ego is embarrassed or inconvenienced. Learning to appreciate your trickster is learning to trust that the psyche is wiser than ego, that what seems like failure or chaos might be exactly what's needed. The demon function, as we've touched on, represents the deepest challenge and the ultimate gift. It's the eighth function, the shadow of the inferior, experienced as utterly alien and threatening. It embodies everything your ego identity has been constructed to avoid. For an extroverted thinking type, the demon is introverted sensation, being trapped in the body, in physical sensation, in present moment limitation. For an introverted feeling type, the demon is extroverted thinking, being reduced to a cog in a system, stripped of individual values, forced into impersonal logic. When the demon erupts unconsciously, it's catastrophic. It can manifest as breakdowns, addictions, violence, or complete loss of meaning. People describe demonic states as possession, a sense that something alien has taken over and they're powerless. This aligns with Jung's discussion of possession by complexes and archetypal powers. The ego is overwhelmed, and an unconscious content dominates consciousness. But Jung also taught that every possession could become a relationship. The key was not to banish or repress the possessing force, but to engage it, understand it, integrate its energy into consciousness. This required tremendous courage and support, usually the container of analysis or deep therapeutic work. Beebe's contribution was to show that the demon wasn't random, but followed from your type. Knowing your eighth function, you could anticipate its themes and prepare for its emergence. You could recognize early signs that it was being activated and take preventive action. And if you were in a position of relative health and support, you could consciously approach it, seeking its guardian aspect rather than waiting for its destructive eruption. This conscious approach to the demon was advanced Jungian work, not for beginners. It required a strong ego, developed auxiliary and tertiary functions, and usually a relationship with an analyst or guide. But for those ready for it, engaging the demon offered profound transformation, bringing into consciousness the function that had been most split off, most disowned. Jung's own engagement with his unconscious, documented in his Red Book, showed this pattern. He descended into fantasies and visions that could easily have become psychotic. He encountered archetypal figures who challenged his sanity and identity, but he maintained a relationship with them, recording their words, questioning them, gradually integrating their messages. This active engagement prevented possession while allowing transformation. The Red Book, published only after Jung's death, revealed how personal and terrifying this work was. Jung encountered the chaos and darkness of the unconscious directly, without the defenses most people maintain. His visions included destruction, death, violence, and madness. He didn't sanitize or sentimentalize the unconscious. He experienced its full alienness, but he also found meaning there, a sense of purpose and direction that he called the self. The self emerged through the chaos as an organizing principle beyond ego, connecting individual life to cosmic pattern. Encountering the self required surrendering ego control, accepting that consciousness was not the center but part of a larger whole. Beebe's model implied that each type encountered the self through different functional doorways. For Jung, the path was through introverted intuition diving into archetypal depths. For an extroverted thinking type, the path might be through introverted sensation, finally accepting bodily limitation and mortality. For an introverted feeling type, the path might be through extroverted thinking, finally accepting impersonal law and structure. Different paths, same destination. The self as the totality beyond ego. This respect for multiple paths to the same goal was deeply Jungian. Jung rejected the idea of a single correct way to individuation. He saw his own path as specific to his type and circumstances, not universal. He encouraged people to find their own way, using his work as orientation, not prescription. Beebe honored this pluralism through his typological model. There were 16 types, each with their own developmental sequence, their own challenges, their own gifts. No type was better or more spiritual than another. Each offered a unique perspective on reality, a unique path to wholeness. The goal wasn't to become a different type, but to become more fully your own type, integrating all 8 functions into a dynamic balance. This brings us to one of the most important philosophical questions underlying both Jung's and Beebe's work. Is there a unified self, or are we multiple? Is the goal to achieve unity, or to accept multiplicity? Jung's answer was paradoxical. On one hand, he emphasized the self as the organizing center and goal of individuation, implying movement toward unity. On the other hand, he recognized the psyche's inherent multiplicity, its population of complexes and archetypal figures, each with autonomous existence. He resolved this paradox through the concept of integration, not elimination. The self didn't destroy multiplicity, but orchestrated it, allowing different voices their due while maintaining overall coherence. The individuated person wasn't singular but harmonious, with ego relating consciously to the various autonomous contents of the psyche. Beebe's 8-function model embodied this paradox. Your psyche contained 8 distinct function archetypes, each with its own perspective and voice. But they weren't random. They followed a specific order, with the ego complex, dominant and auxiliary, at the apex, mediating between the other functions. Individuation meant allowing all 8 to have their voice while maintaining ego's executive function. This model resonated with contemporary neuroscience and cognitive science, which increasingly understood the mind as a collection of modules or systems rather than a unified entity. The brain contained multiple processing systems, each specialized for different tasks, coordinated but not unified. Consciousness arose from their interaction, not from a single central processor. Beebe's typological model could be seen as a phenomenological description of these multiple systems, understood through Jung's archetypal lens. The dominant function corresponded to the most developed cognitive module, the auxiliary to the supporting module, and so on. The archetypal roles described how these modules felt subjectively, from inside, not how they operated mechanically. This bridge between depth psychology and cognitive science was implicit in Beebe's work, though he didn't emphasize it. His focus remained clinical and phenomenological, describing lived experience rather than brain mechanisms. But the compatibility suggested that Jungian typology, refined through Beebe's model, might have more scientific validity than skeptics assumed. Jung himself had mixed feelings about scientific validation. On one hand, he wanted psychology to be rigorous and empirical, based on observation, not speculation. He documented his cases carefully, sought patterns, tried to formulate general principles. On the other hand, he recognized that the psyche's deepest dimensions resisted scientific method. How could you measure the numinous? How could you quantify a symbol's meaning? How could you subject the self to experiment? His solution was to claim psychology as a science of subjectivity, studying inner experience with the same rigor other sciences studied outer phenomena. This required different methods, amplification, active imagination, dream analysis, but these could be systematic and disciplined. The results couldn't be reduced to numbers, but they had their own validity, confirmed through clinical outcomes and the patient's sense of increased wholeness. Beebe continued this tradition, using typology scientifically in the sense of creating a coherent system that could be tested against observation, but not scientistically, reducing psyche to mechanism. His model could predict patterns this type would struggle in this way, benefit from this intervention, and those predictions could be confirmed or disconfirmed through experience. But the model remained phenomenological, honoring the lived quality of psychological experience. As you breathe in the darkness, letting these ideas wash over and through you, notice how the conversation between Jung and Beebe is really a conversation about being human. How do we understand ourselves? How do we recognize patterns without reducing complexity? How do we honor both unity and multiplicity, both consciousness and unconscious, both individual uniqueness and universal structure. These questions don't have final answers, and that's appropriate. Jung and Beebe weren't offering conclusions but tools for ongoing exploration. Typology was a way to begin understanding yourself, not to finish. Knowing your type was like getting a map of your home territory. You still had to walk every path, discover every hidden corner, live in the actual landscape. Beebe's particular gift was making that map more detailed and accurate. Jung had sketched the main features. Beebe filled in the topography. Where Jung said, "Here be dragons," the inferior function, Beebe said, "Here is the anima, or animus, gateway to the unconscious, both terrifying and necessary." Where Jung noted shadow functions existed, Beebe identified their specific archetypal qualities and how they emerged. This level of detail served practitioners, analysts, therapists, counselors who needed to understand their clients' dynamics quickly and accurately. It also served individuals on the path of self-understanding, offering language to describe their inner experience. How many people had felt the harsh voice of the critical parent without knowing it was a shadow function? How many had experienced the trickster's sabotage without recognizing its pattern? Beebe gave names to experiences people had but couldn't articulate. This naming power shouldn't be underestimated. Jung understood that consciousness required language. To make the unconscious conscious, you needed words for what had been wordless. His entire theoretical edifice, archetypes, complexes, shadow, anima, self, was an act of naming, giving linguistic form to psychic realities that had been experienced but not articulated. Beebe's contribution to this naming project was to create a language for functional dynamics. Words like opposing personality, critical parent, trickster, and demon might seem simple, but they crystallized patterns that had been vague. You could now say, "That's my critical parent attacking through my shadow auxiliary," instead of just feeling terrible about yourself. This linguistic precision was therapeutic, creating distance and perspective. Jung had emphasized the importance of symbolic language for capturing psyche's imaginal dimension. Dreams spoke in images, not concepts. Archetypes appeared as mythological figures, not abstract principles. To engage the unconscious required learning its poetic, metaphorical language. Beebe balanced this symbolic approach with conceptual clarity. His model used precise terms and logical structure, making it accessible to thinking types and those from cognitive behavioral backgrounds. But he also encouraged personification and active imagination, engaging the function archetypes as living figures. This both-and approach honored different learning styles and different functions, recognizing that some people needed conceptual frameworks while others needed imaginal relationships. This flexibility reflected Beebe's clinical wisdom. Different patients needed different approaches. Some needed the security of a clear framework before they could explore freely. Others felt constrained by frameworks and needed permission to follow intuition. A good analyst adapted to the patient's type and needs, not forcing everyone into the same method. Jung had modeled this flexibility, though his own style tended toward the intuitive and symbolic. He recognized that a thinking type needed logical explanations, while a feeling type needed empathic connection. He adjusted his language and approach accordingly, though always within his basic analytical framework. Beebe made this flexibility more systematic. If you understood a patient's functional stack, you could predict what kind of interventions would work. For someone with tertiary extroverted feeling, group therapy might be both challenging and healing, engaging their vulnerable child function. For someone with dominant introverted thinking, Socratic questioning might feel natural, playing to their hero function while gently developing auxiliary and tertiary functions. This predictive power made typology practically valuable, but it also carried risks. The risk was stereotyping, treating the patient as a type rather than an individual. Jung had warned against this repeatedly. No person perfectly matched their type description. Everyone was unique, shaped by personal history, culture, and circumstance. Type was an orientation, not a destiny. Beebe emphasized this same caution. His model wasn't a box to squeeze people into, but a tool for understanding patterns. The individual always exceeded the type. Two INFJs would share a functional stack but differ profoundly in how they expressed it based on their unique experiences, wounds, and gifts. The model illuminated commonalities without erasing differences. This tension between pattern and uniqueness lies at the heart of all personality psychology. We seek patterns to make human behavior comprehensible, but we risk losing sight of individual complexity. Jung and Beebe both navigated this tension carefully, offering patterns while insisting on their limitations. Perhaps the deepest gift of both thinkers was their commitment to honoring mystery. Jung could have reduced the psyche to known categories, claiming complete understanding. Instead, he constantly emphasized what he didn't know, what remained mysterious and numinous. The self, the collective unconscious, the archetypal realm, these pointed to dimensions beyond ego comprehension. Beebe maintained this reverence for mystery while adding structure. Yes, the 8 functions followed predictable patterns, but how they manifested in each person's life remained unique and surprising. Yes, the demon function posed known challenges, but encountering it personally was still terrifying and transformative, not predictable or controlled. The model oriented you, but it didn't eliminate the need for courage, compassion, and patience. Now, in this late hour, as thoughts begin to dissolve into the approaching tide of sleep, let yourself rest in the space between knowing and not knowing. Jung and Beebe have given us maps, but the territory remains vast and alive, changing as we explore it. Your psyche, with its 8 function archetypes, its hero and shadow and demon, is not a fixed structure, but a living process, unfolding day by day. The conversation between these two thinkers continues in the quiet places of your own inner life. When you notice your critical parent's harsh voice, you're continuing their work. When you catch your trickster causing mischief, you're living their insights. When you encounter your inferior function's vulnerability, you're walking the path they illuminated. This is how ideas live, not just in books, but in the actual experience of people seeking to understand themselves. Jung spent the last decades of his life at his tower in Bollingen, a space he built with his own hands as a monument to his inner work. He carved stone, tended his garden, received visitors, and continued writing. The tower grew organically, room by room, as his understanding deepened. It was a physical manifestation of his psyche's architecture, each addition representing new integration. Beebe, practicing as an analyst in San Francisco, seeing patients, training new analysts, lecturing, writing, was also building not in stone but in the lives of those he worked with. Each analysis was a unique creation, a joint project of understanding and healing. His typological model wasn't a monument, but a living tool, tested and refined through thousands of hours of clinical work. These different forms of contribution, the solitary scholar and the engaged clinician, the grand theoretical vision and the practical framework, complement each other perfectly. Psychology needs both. It needs visionaries who glimpse new territories and cartographers who make those territories navigable. Jung and Beebe, in their different ways, served both functions for analytical psychology. The legacy of their work continues in multiple streams. In clinical settings, Jungian analysts use typological understanding to deepen their work with patients. In organizational development, consultants use type frameworks to improve team communication and leadership. In personal growth communities, individuals explore their types as part of self-understanding. In academic psychology, researchers investigate the validity and utility of typological systems. Each of these streams takes Jung and Beebe's work in different directions, emphasizing different aspects, sometimes moving far from the original depth psychological context. This is inevitable and, to some degree, healthy. Ideas evolve as they're applied in new contexts. But there's also value in returning to the source, remembering the depth and complexity of the original vision. What made Jung's and Beebe's work profound was their insistence that typology served individuation, not just personality. Description. The point wasn't to know your type, but to become more whole. The point wasn't to categorize yourself, but to recognize and integrate your shadow. The point wasn't to find the perfect type match in relationship, but to use relationship friction as fuel for growth. Typology was always in service of something larger, the soul's journey toward itself. This teleological dimension, the idea that psyche has a direction, a purpose, a goal, is central to Jungian psychology. Jung believed consciousness was not an accident, but the universe becoming aware of itself. Human beings were the leading edge of this cosmic awakening, capable of reflecting on their own existence, of bringing unconscious contents to light, of choosing how to engage with the archetypal forces moving through them. Beebe shared this vision. His functional model wasn't just descriptive, but developmental. You moved through the functions in a sequence that led toward greater consciousness and integration. The hero learned to work with the parent. The child was healed. The anima, or animus, was engaged. The shadow functions were recognized and integrated. And in rare moments of grace, the demon was transformed from destroyer to guardian. This is the heroic journey in psychological terms. Each person living out the eternal myth of consciousness, emerging from unconscious, light from darkness, order from chaos. Jung read this myth in every culture's stories: Osiris and Isis, Christ's death and resurrection, Buddha's enlightenment under the Bodhi tree, the alchemical transformation of lead into gold. The details varied, but the pattern was universal. Beebe showed how each type lived this universal pattern through specific functions. The INTJ's hero journey involved trusting introverted intuition while developing extroverted thinking, eventually confronting the anima of introverted feeling and the demon of extroverted sensation. The ESFP's journey involved trusting extroverted sensation while developing introverted feeling, eventually confronting the animus of introverted thinking and the demon of extroverted intuition. Different paths, same archetypal structure. This universality within diversity is perhaps the deepest gift of their combined work. You are unique, unrepeatable, unlike anyone else. And you are also participating in patterns as old as humanity, walking paths countless others have walked. Both truths are important. Your uniqueness matters, and you're part of something larger than yourself. Jung's concept of the collective unconscious affirmed this dual reality. You had a personal unconscious, containing your unique memories and repressed experiences. But beneath that lay the collective unconscious, shared by all humans, containing the archetypes that structured experience across cultures and times. You were individual and collective, separate and connected, isolated and participating in the whole. Beebe's model operated at both levels. Your specific, a functional stack was unique to you, shaped by temperament and development. But the archetypal roles of the functions, hero, parent, child, anima, opposing personality, critical parent, trickster, demon, were universal, appearing in everyone's psyche. You had your own hero function, but everyone had a hero function, and heroism as an archetypal pattern transcended any individual expression. This layered understanding prevented both excessive individualism and collectivist dissolution. You couldn't claim complete autonomy, disconnected from human nature and archetypal pattern, but you also couldn't hide in the collective, claiming you were just like everyone else without unique gifts and responsibilities. You were both individual and universal, and maturity required honoring both dimensions. As sleep draws closer, as the words blend into the rhythm of your breathing, let this dual awareness settle into your body. You are wonderfully, specifically yourself, with your unique functional stack, your particular wounds and gifts, your unrepeatable life story, and you are also human, sharing in patterns that precede you and will continue after you, participating in the great conversation of consciousness with itself. Jung and Beebe are two voices in that conversation, speaking across decades, building on each other's insights, pointing toward the same mystery from different angles. Their dialogue continues in you, in me, in everyone who asks the deep questions. Who am I? Why do I struggle? What does my suffering mean? How can I become more whole? These questions don't have simple answers, and that's appropriate. They're meant to orient us, to keep us searching, not to provide neat conclusions. The psyche is too vast, too complex, too alive to be fully mapped. But maps help, and Jung and Beebe have given us remarkably good ones, detailed enough to be useful, open enough to allow discovery. The 8-function model, understood properly, is not a constraint, but a liberation. It says, you don't have to be good at everything. You have specific gifts and specific challenges, and that's okay. Your hero function is meant to be strong, not your demon. Your child function is meant to be playful and vulnerable, not mature and reliable. You can stop exhausting yourself trying to be what your type isn't built for, and instead develop the unique gifts your functional stack offers. This permission to be specifically yourself rather than generically perfect is deeply healing. So much suffering comes from impossible standards, the belief that you should be competent in all areas, comfortable in all situations, equally developed in all functions. Jung and Beebe say, no, that's not how psyche works. You're meant to be excellent in certain ways and beginner in others. Wholeness doesn't mean equal development, but conscious relationship with all parts, even the undeveloped ones. This reframe transforms failure into information. When your trickster sabotages you, it's not evidence of your inadequacy, but evidence that your tertiary function's shadow is active. When your demon erupts, it's not proof that you're broken, but a signal that your deepest unconscious function demands attention. When your critical parent attacks, it's not truth, but your shadow auxiliary distorting perception. Learning to recognize these functional dynamics creates enormous freedom. You can observe your psyche's patterns without being identified with them. You can say, "That's my critical parent talking," rather than believing the criticism is objective truth. You can notice your trickster at work and laugh rather than shame yourself. You can feel your demon stirring and seek support rather than pretending everything is fine. This witnessing consciousness, able to observe the 8 functions without being overwhelmed by them, is what Jung meant by a strong ego. Not an ego that controlled everything, but an ego that could maintain awareness and relationship with all psychic contents. The ego was like the captain of a ship, not creating the wind and waves, but steering through them, listening to the crew, making decisions while recognizing forces beyond its control. Beebe's model helped develop this witnessing capacity by mapping the crew. When you knew you had 8 function archetypes, you could recognize who was speaking at any moment. That's my hero trying to solve everything. That's my parent offering wisdom. That's my child feeling wounded. That's my opposing personality, criticizing. This recognition created space between stimulus and response, between feeling and action. Jung had emphasized that consciousness meant not being identical with psychic contents. If you were identical with an emotion, you couldn't observe it. You simply were it. If you were identical with a thought, you couldn't question it. It was self-evident truth. Consciousness required differentiation, the ability to say, "I'm experiencing anger," rather than, "I am anger." "I'm noticing a thought," rather than being lost in thinking. Typological awareness supported this differentiation. Your functions were aspects of your psyche, not your essence. You had a hero function, but you weren't only your hero. You had a demon, but you weren't only your demon. This distinction allowed relationship rather than identification, integration rather than repression. As the night deepens and consciousness begins its nightly dissolution into sleep, there's something poignant about how Jung and Beebe devoted their lives to understanding consciousness. They knew it was fragile, temporary, always at risk of being overwhelmed by unconscious forces. Sleep, madness, death, all represented consciousness's dissolution, the return to undifferentiated psychic life. And yet they also knew consciousness was precious, the universe's way of knowing itself, worth cultivating and protecting. Every person who did the work of individuation, who brought unconscious contents to light, who integrated shadow and engaged the self, was participating in consciousness's expansion. This was spiritual work, though not religious in a conventional sense. Jung's complex relationship with religion colored his entire psychology. Raised as a pastor's son, he rejected dogmatic Christianity but remained fascinated by religious experience. He saw religious symbols as expressions of archetypal realities, attempts to articulate encounters with the numinous. The Trinity, the Virgin Mary, the suffering Christ, these were not historical facts to believe or reject, but symbols pointing towards psychic truths. Beebe, also influenced by religious questions, brought this symbolic understanding to typology. The archetypal roles of the functions, hero, parent, child, anima, opposing personality, critical parent, trickster, demon, were like a personal pantheon, the gods and goddesses of your inner life. You had a relationship with each, sometimes harmonious, sometimes conflicted, always significant. This polytheistic framing honored the psyche's multiplicity while avoiding the literalism of traditional religion. You didn't have to believe in external gods, but could recognize divine patterns within psyche itself. The hero was Hercules and Christ, and every human facing a challenge. The trickster was Loki and Coyote, and your own tendency to undermine yourself. The demon was Satan and Kali, and your deepest shadow function. Jung had written that the gods had become diseases, no longer worshipped consciously but erupting as symptoms. In modernity, with its rejection of myth and religion, archetypal energies didn't disappear. They went unconscious, manifesting as compulsions, neuroses, psychosomatic illness. The cure was not to return to literal belief, but to recognize the gods as psychic realities, giving them conscious attention and relationship. Beebe's work fit perfectly with this vision. By identifying the archetypal gods in your functional stack, you could give them conscious worship, or at least recognition. You could honor your hero without inflation. You could respect your demon without being destroyed. You could laugh with your trickster without being sabotaged. This was modern spirituality, psychological and interior, but no less significant than ancient temple worship. This brings us to the question of meaning, so central to Jung's psychology. He believed the crisis of modern life was a crisis of meaning. Without religious frameworks, without connection to myth and symbol, people felt empty, directionless, depressed. The most successful people often felt most meaningless, having achieved external goals but finding them hollow. Jung's answer was individuation, which was ultimately about discovering your unique meaning and purpose. Not a meaning handed down by tradition or authority, but meaning that emerged from your deep self, your connection to the archetypal realm, your specific calling in this life. Analysis helped people discover and live this unique meaning. Beebe's typological model contributed to this search for meaning by clarifying your unique structure and thus your unique potential contribution. Your functional stack suggested your natural gifts and where you'd struggle, your likely life path and where you'd need to stretch. An INTJ's meaning would involve using introverted intuition to perceive patterns and possibilities, probably in service of some vision or reform. An ESFP's meaning would involve using extroverted sensation to bring joy and spontaneity to others, fully inhabiting the present moment. Neither meaning was better, just different. The culture might value one type more than another. Modern industrial society often privileged thinking over feeling, extroversion over introversion, but from the psyche's perspective, all types were equally valid expressions of human potential. Your task was not to become a different type, but to fully inhabit your own, developing it to its highest expression. This affirmation of type as vocation was liberating. You didn't have to be what society expected, or what your parents wanted, or what looked successful. You had to be what your deepest nature called you to be. And that nature had structure, patterns, tendencies that could be understood through typology. Jung's own life modeled this principle. He could have had a comfortable career as a conventional psychiatrist, fitting into medical establishment expectations. Instead, he followed his inner calling into strange territory, alchemy, mythology, Gnosticism, the unconscious. He was often misunderstood, sometimes attacked, occasionally dismissed as mystical or unscientific. But he remained true to his vision, his introverted intuition, perceiving patterns no one else saw. Beebe's path was different but equally authentic. He found his calling in clarifying and teaching Jung's typology, making it more accessible and precise. This required different gifts, analytical thinking, systematic organization, pedagogical skill. He didn't chase fame or controversy, but quietly built his model through decades of clinical work and reflection. Both men lived their types, which is the essence of authenticity. They didn't pretend to be what they weren't. They accepted their gifts and limitations, developed their functions as fully as possible, and offered their unique contribution. This is all individuation requires, being fully yourself in service to something larger than ego. And now, as we approach the end of this long night's exploration, as sleep's soft hands reach out to claim consciousness, let's return to where we began. The conversation between two minds, Jung and Beebe, exploring the architecture of personality and soul. They never met in person. Jung died in 1961 when Beebe was still a young medical student, but they met in the dimension where all deep ideas meet, in the collective conversation about human nature, in the ongoing attempt to understand consciousness and its structures. Beebe read Jung, studied Jung, practiced Jung's methods, and then contributed his own insights back into the stream. This is how knowledge grows, not through isolated geniuses, but through conversation across time. Jung built on Freud and then broke with him. Beebe built on Jung and extended him. Future thinkers will build on Beebe, refining the model further, adapting it to new contexts, discovering new dimensions. The conversation continues because the mystery continues, because consciousness keeps asking itself who and what it is. Your participation in this conversation matters. Every time you notice your functions at work, you're confirming or challenging the model. Every time you integrate a shadow element, you're contributing to consciousness's expansion. Every time you help someone else understand their type, you're teaching Jung and Beebe's insights forward. You're not just learning a system, you're living an ongoing exploration of what it means to be human. This collaborative, evolving nature of psychological understanding is different from religious revelation or philosophical system building. Jung didn't claim final truth, and neither did Beebe. They offered provisional maps, tested against experience, open to revision. They trusted that future observers would see what they missed, correct their errors, extend their insights. This humility in the face of psyche's mystery is perhaps their greatest gift. They could have claimed complete understanding, founded schools that enforced orthodoxy, demanded loyalty to their specific formulations. Instead, they encourage students to test everything against their own experience, to develop their own relationship with the unconscious, to trust their own observations. Beebe embodies this non-dogmatic stance. His 8-function model is offered as a useful framework, not revealed truth. He acknowledges its limitations, remains open to revision, encourages others to test and refine it. This is science in the best sense: systematic observation, pattern recognition, tentative conclusions, ongoing testing, willingness to revise. It's also art, because understanding psyche requires imagination, metaphor, narrative. The function archetypes are not just categories, but characters in a story. Your story, the epic of your psyche's journey through life. Beebe gives you the cast lists and suggests their roles, but you're living the actual drama, improvising, discovering how your specific hero and demon and trickster play out in your unique circumstances. And it's spirituality, because engaging these depths connects you to something larger than ego, larger than personal life, something archetypal and eternal. When you meet your demon, you're meeting an ancient force, old as consciousness itself. When you listen to your anima, or animus, you're hearing the voice that has guided seekers through all ages. When you Recognize your trickster. You're encountering the same figure who appears in every mythology: necessary chaos bringer, sacred fool. Jung and Beebe are guides on this journey, not gurus, but elder brothers who've walked the path and turned back to offer help. They're saying, here's what we've learned. Here are the patterns we've noticed. Here are the tools we've found useful. Take what serves you and leave what doesn't. Your journey is your own, but you don't have to travel blind. This generous, supportive tone characterizes both men's work. They genuinely wanted to help, to ease suffering, to facilitate growth. They weren't building personal empires, but serving the larger process of human development. Their reward was the satisfaction of seeing people become more whole, more conscious, more authentically themselves. As consciousness releases its grip and sleep's tide rises, carrying you toward dreams and the night's renewal, hold this gentle awareness. You are understood. Your struggles make sense. Your pain has pattern. Your wounds can heal. Your shadow can be integrated. Your gifts are real and needed. Your journey, with all its difficulty, is meaningful, part of consciousness's great adventure with itself. Jung and Beebe, speaking across time, offer this understanding. They've mapped the territory you're traveling. They've named the companions hero and demon, parent and child, trickster and opposing voice who journey with you. They've shown that your specific way of being, your type with its particular strengths and struggles, is not accident or mistake, but your unique contribution to the vast project of becoming. Rest now in this understanding. Let the words dissolve. Let the concepts fade. Let consciousness gently release into sleep's deeper waters. The 8 function archetypes will still be there tomorrow, playing their roles, inviting relationship, supporting your ongoing individuation. Jung and Beebe's insights will still be available, maps to consult when you feel lost, language to describe what you're experiencing. But for now, just rest. Let the architecture of personality support you like a well-built home. Each function a room with its purpose, each archetype a presence watching over your sleep. Your hero stands guard at the threshold. Your parent offers blessing. Your child dreams innocent dreams. Your anima or animus bridges conscious and unconscious. And even your shadow functions, opposing personality and critical parent and trickster and demon, settle into their proper places, no longer threatening, but part of the whole, part of you. The conversation between Jung and Beebe continues in this night, in your night, in every night, when consciousness and unconscious meet in that liminal space between waking and dreaming. They're still talking, still exploring, still wondering at the mystery of psyche and its structures, still marveling that consciousness exists at all, that mind can turn back on itself, observe itself, understand itself, transform itself, and you're part of that conversation now, carrying their insights forward in your own life, testing them against your experience, living the 8-function drama uniquely. Your dreams tonight might speak in their language, hero and trickster making appearances, anima or animus offering guidance. Or they might speak in pure symbol, imagery that predates any system, archetypal forces moving in their ancient patterns. Either way, you're held by something larger than any theory, any model, any understanding. You're held by psyche itself, that vast and subtle reality that Jung and Beebe devoted their lives to exploring. You're held by the self, that mysterious organizing center that guides your development even when ego is confused. You're held by the collective unconscious, connecting you to all who've ever wondered about consciousness and its journey. Sleep now, wanderer. The night is deep and kind. Tomorrow, consciousness will return with its questions and struggles, its joys and discoveries. The functions will activate in their familiar patterns, hero leading the way, shadows making their mischief, anima or animus calling from the depths. But tonight, let it all dissolve into rest, into renewal, into the darkness from which consciousness emerges each morning, fresh and ready to explore again. Jung and Beebe have shown us the architecture of the psyche, the eightfold structure that organizes our experience. But ultimately, that structure serves life, serves love, serves the ongoing miracle of consciousness awakening to itself. The model is beautiful, useful, true in its way, but you are more than any model, more than any type, more than any system can capture. You are an unrepeatable expression of consciousness, living your unique version of the universal journey, dancing the eternal dance in your particular way. Rest in that vastness. Rest in that specificity. Rest in the conversation between Jung and Beebe that continues through you. And when you wake, may you recognize a little more clearly the cast of characters inhabiting your psyche. May you relate to them with a little more compassion and wisdom. May you walk your path with a little more confidence and grace. The story ends as it began, with an invitation to rest, to drift, to let the mind's grasping soften into sleep's gentle embrace. Jung and Beebe have given us their gifts, maps of the psyche's territory, language for inner experience, hope that consciousness can expand and integrate, confidence that the journey toward wholeness is real and possible. Take these gifts into sleep, into dreams, into the renewal that night offers, and tomorrow wake as yourself, beautifully and specifically yourself, with your 8 function archetypes ready to dance another day, with hero and shadow, parent and child, anima and demon, all present, all part of your wholeness, all contributing to the ongoing miracle of your consciousness, exploring itself. This is what Jung and Beebe offer. Not answers, but deepened questions. Not solutions, but better tools for the journey. Not escape from the psyche's complexity, but maps that make that complexity navigable and meaningful. Welcome to the conversation, wanderer. Welcome to your own depth. Welcome to the eightfold architecture of your particular soul. And welcome to sleep, where all structures dissolve and consciousness returns to the source, the collective unconscious, the mystery from which we all emerge and to which we all return, night after night, in preparation for the next day's unfolding, the next chapter in the eternal story of mind waking to itself, light emerging from darkness, consciousness blossoming in the vast garden of being. Sleep well, knowing you are understood. Sleep deep, trusting in the patterns Jung and Beebe illuminated. Sleep peacefully, held by the very structures they described, the archetypal forces that organize experience, the functions that give your consciousness its particular shape and color and music. And when you wake, may you see yourself and others with new eyes, recognizing the hero's struggle, honoring the child's vulnerability, respecting the demon's power, learning from the trickster's chaos, listening to the parent's wisdom. This is the gift of their conversation, Jung and Beebe, speaking across time about the psyche's architecture, about personality's patterns, about the eightfold path that each of us walks in our unique way. May their insights guide you gently through sleep's territory and into tomorrow's renewed exploration. May you know yourself more deeply, Love yourself more compassionately, and walk your path more consciously, carrying forward the conversation about consciousness that connects us all, that makes us human, that turns life into something more than mere survival, into meaning, into purpose, into the sacred work of becoming who you most deeply are. Good night, wanderer. Rest well. In the territory Jung mapped and Beebe clarified, your psyche's 8 functions will keep their vigil: hero protecting, parent guiding, child dreaming, anima bridging worlds. And tomorrow, you'll wake to play your part in the great conversation, the ongoing exploration of consciousness, the eternal question of who and what we are, which Jung and Beebe have illuminated so beautifully, so usefully, so kindly for all who seek to understand the marvelous mystery of being human.